Cool. So, welcome everyone. I'm Ajay Balmurdas, Head of Customer Success and Strategy at PostQode, and I'm so happy to have Parveen Khan today with me for an AMA on API automation. So, welcome, Parveen. How are you doing?
Thank you. Thanks for having me, first of all, and thanks for inviting. Yeah, I'm good.
And
I'm
we have
glad to be joining this discussion today.
very nice, very nice. Thank you. And we have the audience slowly trickling in as well. And no, you almost hit a century, 99 registrations. Okay, so we are expecting as the minutes pass by, more and more people joining in. So let's get started. And the first question that I want to ask is many people, many
Ajay,
testers are focusing on UI automation.
Ajay,
So how does the automation strategy differ from, say, UI to API automation? If you had to do API automation, what would you change?
Yeah, I see someone has their hands up. Maybe they want to say something before we keep.
No, they're just testing out, maybe. Yeah.
Ajay just wanted to know like recording is started or not.
Yeah, it started.
Yeah, okay, perfect. Thanks.
Cool.
Yeah. Repeat, how does your automation strategy change from UI to API automation?
Yeah. Yeah, I know. Like a lot of time when we think about automation, right? The first thought comes into mind is like UI automation, and that's the first instinct, and that's the first approach we go to. And I think it also, so for me, like when I'm working on the teams, the mostly it depends, like, how, the type of the project we are working on. What is it? Like, what is the architecture? Where does the business logic, like, sit? Where does it go? I think we need to take a lot of consideration into different elements when we're thinking about. I think that's what will change. That's what changes for me when to, like, what the strategy for UI automation is, or whether to do API automation, because both solve different problems. We are doing both to get confidence in what we're testing, right? But at the different layers, at the different levels, and we need to like a lot of different factors. Like, for example, like if you're working in microservices, like in a distributed architecture where you're working in cross-functional, then it becomes even more important that you look at API level, because that's where you'll get the speed feed, like you get the early feedback. And because so that's another factor to think about how your automation, like the strategy changes from the UI and API. And when we think, also, like UI automation is more about, we need to think what is it that it's trying to solve, right? It's more about the business, like user facing, the more critical journeys. So if the product or the project that you're working in is more very UI focused, like for example, you need accessibility driven, usability driven, and most of there's a lot of elements in as a user interactions on your user interface, then definitely yes. So it depends on all these factors to see where to focus more and where to put your efforts more, and where does it make more sense to have the automation involved. So I think that is where the strategy itself is, like the word strategy itself is like understanding all of these to get answers, and then implement your automation as part of your product.
Got got it. See, when we also opened up the registrations, we also asked, the participants to give questions. Okay.
Mm-hmm.
And more than 5 people have asked the same question. How do I get started with API automation? How do I learn? How do I get started? What do you recommend? How should they get started?
So API, yeah. I think if people who are like me, maybe, like, if like if when I started first, right, I'll be very, like, openly I can say that it was a scary thing for me to start API automation, thinking that, because UI automation is more like, that you'll see what's happening, and it's very I won't say it's very easy, but it's more visually, you can see what's happening, what to automate, like user journeys and stuff. And when it comes to API automation, it's like it's all like underneath, like, it's more like, oh, where do I start, what do I look for, like, And I think the easiest way I found was to start with small, to start with, okay, if you're looking at your existing, if you want to look, if you're looking at implementing this on your existing project, for example, start with small, with looking at thinking that let me build API automation on my project. Don't think that way. Think that let me build smoke test. Let me start with simple steps. But even before even starting to say like I want to build smoke test, think before that, like understand what are your different APIs and points that you have. What are they doing? Do like I same like for UI automation, right? When you don't just straight away jump into implementing UI automation. You first explore, you understand the product, you try to understand what are the most critical journeys, and you do all of these. Let's do the same thing. Same thing applies to API automation. So for you to start with, get comfortable with using the APIs, like maybe if you have like Swagger or Open API specs, so use those what you have existingly before jumping into any of the tool, so that you explore, you understand what is the request, what is it doing, like what is it calling. So just understand that logic first, play hands on, like understand that, and then use um, Postman is my first go-to tool, like because it has a user interface and it has a good way to start getting comfortable with something like this. So I always recommend using Postman to start with. Any kind of use any uh, existing playground, like you have any test sites where you have so many things right now, right? So many people have open source things where you can practice these things. So start with small, understanding how APIs work, what is it doing, what the functionality is, and spend more time in getting comfortable exploring that, playing around with request and trying to break it, trying to learn how does it work, and then get into like automate that. And that's when you'll start understanding, okay, this is how it is working. And then you need to understand, okay, what is it that you're comfortable with? Do you want to move? Do you want to continue with Postman? And you can always automate using the same tool as well, right? Or you want to move ahead based on the project needs, whether you want to use rest assured. So it's up to you. But I think start small, get comfortable, explore, and then build a smoke test, run them in the pipeline, and then expand that.
Got it. Got it. So as you mentioned about exploring APIs, right? So when I also started exploring APIs, um, before you learn about those APIs, it feels like, oh, a different world. But at the end of the day, if you know testing, you can
Yes.
apply the same principles on APIs as well. You can start with simple things like, what is it? What is it supposed to do? Is it doing what it is supposed to do? What if
Yeah.
we change what it wants? What are the
Yes.
mandatory fields? What are the optional ones? Why is
Yes.
mandatory? Mandatory can is it really mandatory? How is it different from UI? And asking all the right kind of questions, right?
Exactly.
Which we very well do with UI, do the same
Yeah.
with APIs, right? And you rightly mentioned about use them, learn from that, and then think of automating them. Okay,
Yes.
good, good.
Yeah.
So with API automation, any good practices that you recommend that you have been using, and then you feel, oh, Ajay, these are the things that I really like, and when I review, for example, an API automation project or any of those frameworks, I definitely look for these. Anything like that?
Good practices in the sense, like it's more like I look for like when we're working good, so both ways, right? Looking for the tool that we're using, but at the same time, how are we using within the team? Like the good practices more are like, okay, we are implementing this. How easy is it for the desk to pick that up as well, so that it doesn't become just the QEs or the testers owning that or implementing that. So that's another good practice of getting the team to pair while we're implementing. And it's more good practice of like looking at how well can we design and maintain the test data management around how we implementing automation. And another good practice is like looking at making like making sure we have enough, we just don't check for positives, like not just for happy path, like just response codes, like don't just look for those. go beyond that. I think that's another good practice that we follow, and like it's more around like having some kind of reporting at the back of it. So it's not so the good practice is more around how small tests that we can manage and how well we define and write in a meaningful way that anyone who is new can join and understand what's happening. So very basic, not very heavy, but very basic way of like pairing, collaborating, and anyone who's joining can understand these what we are doing, and what like writing a little readme file of what exactly it is doing, like what are we testing, what are we using, if you want to run this locally, how can you run. So I think writing those instructions, that so these are the little good practices that we use.
Yeah, I think the README part is an interesting one because, sometimes people forget that what we build, what we do is not just for us, but
Yeah,
others also will use it in the future.
yeah,
And as you mentioned about having a README file with instructions on how to run it and why
yeah,
are we doing all of this will definitely help the next team member who is going to use,
yeah,
the similar framework or the same framework. Nice.
yeah, yeah, yeah. Because not everyone will be in the same context. We all always need to understand that it's not just only for us, like who is implementing it, or even not just for the team, right? If you, especially, I think this is even more helpful when you're working in the cross team, where people can make use of what you have already built. So it's easy if you have written everything documented, having it well documented of what it does, why, and how. So it becomes even more easy, and that's another way of creating the visibility, or I can say the efficiency of what you're writing, and making reusing the same practices across the whole other teams as well.
Any interesting API projects that you have been part of?
Yeah, a few of them, very like, yeah, quite a lot of them, I would say. Like, one of the interesting project I can share from my previous place is like, I was part of a backend team. I was back, so we had a split between like front end team and a backend team. So that was my first time working in such setup, because always it was we develop everything kind of a project, but that was my first time having that split of complete backend and complete UI. It was interesting, especially because you need to understand how your consumers are, like your consumers are your not just your own like other APIs or your own APIs that you're building, but also the UI that you're building for, right? And because it is like part of two different teams, how are you testing to make sure you understand what the UI is like, even though I think my initial understanding was like, oh, it's backend, so we don't have to worry about UI. Like, that's the mindset that I had, which is why I found it very interesting, because that kind of broke my what I had an understanding. Because even though you are in the backend project or you're testing the APIs, you always need to, I look at the holistic approach. You still need to understand how the UI is consuming, whether it's UI or other API, right? So I'm using my example as a UI because that was it. So it my approach totally changed when I actually started collaborating with the front end team to understand not how they're building, but to understand what is it that they're building and how are they consuming the APIs behind it, and how are they showing that, how is the data being shown, and where, and how does that flow, what are the user journeys that they use. So I think that was an interesting project and way for me to see how important it is for us to understand the consumers as well while we're building the APIs, because you can't just say that, oh, we are building the API, so it's just consumers can consume it whatever way they can. But it's more to us to understand. We own that. We need to understand that how is it be how are they working, and because it's still the same project, we are the same, we even though we are two different teams, it was good to get that collaboration and understand, and for them to understand how are we building and what is it we are having the challenges from the backend perspective when they are using the forms and pulling the data. So that was for me a very interesting project, and how we all had this illusion that, okay, we don't care, like front end had the same illusion in the back end as well, and including me. And then we all came together before the launch, and we did a bug bash. That's how we all like, build like that was a very interesting project of how we all came together and did the bug bash, and we understood how everything is working together before we release, so that instead of saying that, okay, we will release our stuff, we have built it, we will release our stuff, we have built it. So I think that was my interesting project to understand. Yeah.
When you said, there were two different teams focusing on front end and back end,
Yeah.
I remember one project where I was the QA, and they were, of course, front end and back end teams. The front end development team had developed, the front end for one feature, and the back end had developed the back end for feature number two. And after a week, both came and said, "Okay, we are now ready." But then, feature one is not working in the back end, but the UI is ready. Feature two is working in the back end, but the UI is not ready. And it was uh,
Yeah.
a funny incident, and people had to work extra to fix this. I think
Yeah.
whichever project and water platform, communication and teamwork can't
Yes.
be
Yes. Absolutely.
underestimated at all.
Yeah, exactly. Absolutely. And I think you just need to change your approach, right? Like, even though you're testing, for example, you might be like exactly how you mentioned, like, you might be implementing a feature, you say, like, a feature on the back end, right? And then you do want to see how, where it is breaking, how it is working. And I think you don't have to wait for the big bang bug bash to collaborate. Like, you can collaborate at the lower level, because that's how the early feedback, right? So it doesn't matter even if it's a different team, like pairing, like, checking how things are working and having that access to the UI as well, even though you're not part of UI team, and seeing. So it's about how you structure your testing, even if it is an APIs, still using the same mindset and still using the same approach of exploratory, and how you do that, in how you make use of these tools, and explore and then build a better automation in place.
Mhm. Nice, nice. We'll definitely keep taking the audience questions as well. So, keep sending the questions, and we'll take a few of them at the end. One more question I wanted to ask is, we have a lot of API automation tools. Okay.
Yes.
What, according to you, are the must-have features in these tools? Like, when you go look out for a tool, what are those features that you look forward for?
Yeah. So I've used few tools, right? And I'm biased against few of them, but mostly it's like ease of use. How easy is it for you to get started? Like, how easy it for you to understand the flow of the tool itself? Forget about the flow of like how what you test you're building, but the flow. How easy is it for you to understand the tool itself? And like, also, how easy is it, like, easy, can I say easy, but yeah, how easy it for you to create more test data, or how can you test within the tool if there is a possibility of, like, for example, maybe if your APIs have rate limiting or throttling, for example, and any kind of like security basic. Again, when you talk about security testing, you don't have to be like massive, like, doing a massive testing, but basic level of security testing. Can we do these? Can we run these as part? Can we use this? How easy is it for us to export the test that we have written in case if we want to, right? So I think, and what kind of like reporting capability it has, like, not in depth, but at least a view of what are the different tests we have, and what is the different test suites that we have, how many runs or pass or fail. So something like basic reporting, as I said. So I think these would be very, very basic initial requirement to see if we can have this for any tool that we're using.
So you talked about ease of use, reporting, security, export, right? And then how easy is it to use the tool and understand the entire flow uh,
Yeah.
for your particular application. Good, good, good.
Yeah.
And in API testing, chaining is an important concept where
Yes.
the individual request might work fine, but then the output of a request, you pass it as an input to the next request and then so on, right? So when you chain multiple APIs, what do you think? What are the factors that you pay attention to?
Yeah. I think this is really an interesting thing to do, right? Like a lot of times when we think about API testing, we only think about standalone, like, okay, let's hit this endpoint, we get a response and we get the right request and everything. So we are kind of, but a lot of times depending on the projects again. So this is purely based on one of the project that I was working on where they were, again, multiple teams working together. And it was very back-end heavy project. So chaining was even more critical, more important, because the whole concept of chaining is like you need to understand which API request is being a response for other API, right? And that the more you try to find out, that will build the workflow. So it's kind of like, again, you need to think like APIs as well has their own workflow, their own user journey at the back, just like how we have on the UI. So it's about finding that journey. It really helps forget about like which team is building which endpoint. But if you find that journey, find that workflow, and that's when you can chain which API response is which one, and then document that. And then when you automate that, this is another easier, not easy, but a tricky way, but still it's a good way to, if you don't have contract testing in place, you can still do this. It's kind of a end-to-end / integration testing kind of a thing that you're solving by doing this. I know it's little complex, that you need to understand other teams endpoints, or like, and it becomes more of overhead that who will implement, like, there are challenges with this, but it's more about thinking how critical your backend heavy is your project. Like, for example, as I said, like distributed system, right? And how important is for you to get the early feedback instead of relying on UI, right? Because you can write the same test on UI. Yes, of course, you can write that. But because of the logic is sitting in the low layer, again, the more early feedback you get, the more easy is it for you to fix the issues as well, right? So it's really a good concept to use when, again, I say, like, again, this is not to say that not to use contract testing and maybe use this. It's another option. If you don't have that, maybe this is another option that we can use to test the integrations between the different services. So it's like an end-to-end testing for APIs, for chaining when we use this concept, and keeping it simple, like just like UI testing, right? When we test UI testing, like we test the critical user journeys, right? We don't test the every possible cases. Same way, keeping API automation as like test different scenarios as part of standalone test, but test the workflow as a chaining request. So that way you kind of build a smart test suite so that you don't just test the responses and negative scenarios and other edge cases, but also you test that the chaining, the workflow is working, because that's important, right? Your endpoint might be working as you exactly said, right? It might be working when you're hitting it through Swagger or anything like that, but when other API is consuming it, maybe your contract has changed. That's when you will understand if it has changed or not, only when you have this chaining in place.
Yeah, so under related question to chaining, Srini asks, how do you chain API requests?
So how do you chain? So first thing is, like, you need to understand as I said, right, which API is calling which API, whether it's a request one, whether it's what is the request for this API when you hit there and it goes to there. Like, how can I give an example?
Like
Maybe
the order of the API.
yeah, order. Like, you need to first find out the order, and then when you're calling the API, like, this is how you will chain. If the API is looking for request from this API one, then you need to. So that's how you build the test. So that's how you build the chain. That is what is, like, I think chaining is, that's what the terminology is for me when I'm talking about chaining.
So more like run this API before a particular
Yes, prerequisite.
API.
Yeah.
Right. And do you run it before every test, or before each of these APIs, or just once and then you run all of these APIs, and then more like a post-processing, you run the next API, and then
Yeah.
you kind of clean up, more like a setup and tear down concept,
Yeah.
but for
Yeah.
APIs, right?
Yeah.
Good. See, many testers while testing APIs, right, as you rightly called out in one of your answers, that they hit and check the status codes, right? And then
Yeah.
maybe they check the um, response time, and then maybe they check the size, right? And then they stop. I said, okay, all good, right? This is more like a cursory check. Like, okay,
Yeah.
you have an API endpoint, and then you tested, you hit it, and then you saw that, okay, response came. Okay, there's a response code. There's a status code. There's a size, response size, and then there is a response time. What other checks, what other tests should we do to confidently say that, okay, I'm done with this API test in a thorough manner compared to the cursory checks?
Yeah, I mean, a lot, again, it comes back to the exploring, right? So a lot. It's like checking, like for example, if the endpoint has like mandatory fields, like you checking all the fields, like special, like putting in like special characters, for example, or like from the security perspective, like maybe SQL injection as a thing, and then checking if it is breaking, like from the security perspective. And like if you have capability, like if you have the performance testing capability in-house in place, like for example doing load testing as part of this, and not just checking. Again, it comes back to the and workflow, right? Workflow part, right? Not just checking on its own, but also checking whether the consuming API, like whoever is consuming your API, even that is working fine, the interaction is working fine, the contracts are not broken. And a lot of stuff, I feel like maybe you just need to you need to think just like a critical, like just like a tester, like you how you test the UI of various different combinations around the response and the payload. Try different variations around that, like send the request without the mandatory field. So error handling, yeah, this is exactly, error handlings are the thing as well. Like how does your API handle errors, or do you have rate limiting or the retry mechanism in place? So how do you test that? And also checking that when you're hitting your endpoint, do you have enough logs in place that checks that you getting the right information at the back of it when things are not working the as expected? Do you understand through the logs that what's it's saying, right? Do you have that meaningful logs? And do you have any, like you need to look at all of these things as well, because this as well is part of the testing, right? So you need to check whether does this need a alerting in place around certain threshold. If there are number of 500 errors, do you need to do health check around this? So these are a lot of, yeah, like function, same thing as UI, right? When you're thinking about a single endpoint, a particular API, think about both functional and I call it as cross-functional, which is called as non-functional aspects. Think about both of these and like perform the testing is how I would say.
Yeah, so your points tie well to a framework called components of a test, like a configuration, operation, observation, and evaluation. Like, okay, can you change the configuration? Does the API still work?
Yeah.
Change the mode of operation? Can you change the pace of operation, your rate limiting, all of that? And does it still work?
Yes.
Does
Failover.
it, does, when the status says 200, like Srini is mentioning, 200 does not mean test case pass, but
Yes.
is the real response or like the output really um, a, a true representation of what has happened? Or it is just at one layer, it says everything is good, like user
Yes.
created, but the user never got created. So like
Yes.
you hit a endpoint to create a user, but then
Yeah.
go check back
Checking the,
in the
yeah,
DB,
database. Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
And then maybe call that user in the next API and
Yeah.
see if you get those
Yeah.
values or not.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
then evaluate different in different ways the same request response.
Yeah.
As you mentioned, explore in depth about the response.
Yeah.
You can even change in the request, and there are a lot of combinations. So the
Yes.
good thing about API automation is it's quite fast compared to UI
Yes.
automation. So you
Yes.
do a lot more tests and get
Yeah.
can do a lot more checks and
Yeah.
get those responses, validate quickly, and yeah, kind of
Yeah.
cover a lot of breadth. Right.
Exactly, exactly. And just like UI, when you're testing UI, you just don't look at UI, right? You do look at other things as well. You look at database, you look at logs and a lot of stuff, right? Same thing applies to API. When you're testing API, exactly how you said, when you hit an endpoint which creates a user, you just don't look at the response and say, yeah, it's created. You go look into the database, you look into the log and see if it's giving the right details and everything. So I think that's how it's another holistic way of looking at the API testing.
Hmm, hmm. Good. So with such a rich playground for testers, the APIs, right? Why are people still behind UI automation?
Um, why are people? I think it also like a lot of time, like maybe again, not I don't know. There could be different factors, right? There could be different reasons. Like because I see some of the projects that I worked previously, right? When it's not just upon us, but more like product as well. Be like they are more reliant on. They get more confidence when they see there's more UI test and they see that we have that automation in place, right? So there are different things, like maybe you have legacy and combination of a legacy and a new services where you have limitations that you really want to test it on lower layer but you cannot, but because of those limitations. And UI automation seems to be much like go to start to say, like to show the business that yes, we have automation in place. So this is where, like, this is what gives the confidence, and showing the dashboards, for example, right, to say that okay, these journeys are working. So I think that's one of the factor I would say, that maybe again, maybe people are like looking at because it seems like it's easy to implement as well, that you can straight away start, you can straight away use the page, like you can just start automating what's on the UI. It seems to be easy, but I think it's more complicated than what is API, is how I would say, because there's a lot of main like flakiness that comes with it. But it seems to be easy to start, but the more and more you implement, you start building the flakiness and it becomes more of a maintenance burden and stuff. But I see that some of the people, like even me, like on some of the projects, we had to do UI test just because we had the limitations that the product wanted more confidence only by looking at the UI, by like BDD style of test. But for us to break down that mindset, I think it just needs to have the balance, like saying that okay, what is the more core business critical user journey that you care about, that shouldn't be broken, that you really want to see always, we can build it on UI and the rest we can cover on API. So it's more, it depends a lot on and the backend project that I was talking about, the example, right? We couldn't build any, the UI team, they couldn't build any they had to rely more on UI test because it because of the architecture that we had, because of the tools that we had in place. We had limitations, the security limitations we had, that we couldn't implement contract testing or API testing, very basic level of API testing. So it all has a different factors of why people might be going, the reason. But as I said, there are a lot of people who think UI testing is so simple, we can just kickstart, because it gives the UI validation as well, right? You straight away start find, like you can straight away start. You just I just feel like maybe yeah, people start using Cypress or Playwright or Selenium, for example, right? We can just build the test cases, jumping into the solution, and we can show the value that it is. I think the urge to show the value of automation, like to show that we have automated something, that might be another reason why it drives people to go behind UI automation.
Okay. So
Yeah.
there's one more question. How do you discover business rules at service? Because Swagger Doc doesn't seem to give you all the information. Then how do you discover the required information?
Yeah. Some of it should help it. So I think this is where I think it becomes more like the documentation again. Your use when you working, like, when you have a user story, like, when you're working on it, I think that's where you need to have that understanding of what are the business rules and what is sitting. So not everything, again, like, not everything can be found at one place, for example, for APIs as well, right? You might know certain, there is a limitation, you might know what is it doing for that specific thing, like for that specific endpoint, like, but you won't know the bigger picture, right? So that's where the business rules comes in. And I think it depends from team to team. Like, for example, the teams that I work with, the business rules are written in the form of acceptance criteria, and we document it as part of the Confluence page to say, okay, this is the limitation like, ideally it should be like, you will have contracts, and you will write your business rules against those contracts, and you say, this is what my contract is, and this is what the other team's contract is, and that's how you will check the agreements between the contract and the business rules, right? But if you don't have that in place, then using the existing availability, I think the way we do is like having acceptance criteria and the Confluence page to write down all the business rules to understand what does this do. It's not an ideal way, but if you have that limitation, I think it's better to document, better to talk about what the business rules are, than not talking about it and just relying on what's on the Swagger document.
Got it. And have you used AI in API automation?
Yet to explore. No, I haven't used that yet to explore that side.
Good. Yeah. So any more questions? Anyone from the audience? Feel free to unmute, come on video, and ask your question to Parveen.
So, hi Praveen. So, did you leverage the option of postboot in Postman for doing API testing?
So have you used Postbot in Postman? Is the question.
No, not yet. I haven't, yeah, that's what I was saying, like, I haven't explored AI, like, yeah, part of it. So I haven't explored the postbot yet on the Postman.
So, it automatically generates API test cases
Yeah,
for the given response of that request.
yeah, yeah. Yeah, I think yeah, I think it makes a little life easier if you like, I've just explored on, like, on my own, how do I say, my own side project, but not on actual projects due to the security limitations, I would
Okay,
say. Yeah.
okay, got it.
Yeah. Thanks, Satish. And if you're talking about AI in API automation, Postcode is is the tool to explore, and I'm more than happy to give you a personalized demo to anyone who is interested. Feel free to reply on the email or ajay@postcode.com, and we'll be happy to give you a detailed demo on your use case as well, right?
So I
And
think when I
yeah,
can explore the AI part of postcode, AI part of API testing.
right. Good. So any more questions? Thanks, Satish. Any more questions, anyone? So there's one question by Apurva on, I think the question is gone now. Okay, an example of complex payload. What would be an example of a complex payload, Parveen?
Complex payload. What could be an example of it when it does, when once, yeah, only, how can I give this example? Yeah, when one API does, it has a lot of business rules or a lot of logic, and it has a lot of complex amount of data going into it as part of the payload is what I would say it as a more complex, because it should be much more simple and cleaner and knowing what it is doing. But if it has a lot of one endpoint solving a lot of business, like a lot of logic is I would say, and then if it has many it has a long, I've seen this, like, yeah, I think if it is a very long requirements around what the payload should look like, then it becomes very complex to follow and to implement testing around automation around that as well.
Yeah, and another key thing that we have seen is
Nested.
multiple nested. Yeah, nesting was where I was getting to, like multiple levels of nesting.
Yeah.
And OpenAI has a limitation of it cannot go more than, say, 5 levels of nesting, if I'm not wrong. So levels of nesting is something which is very common in the finance industry. But then many tools fail to, to act on that or use that. Right. And then any mentors you refer to for practicing API testing?
Mentors. I follow
mentors, resources, books, videos, blogs.
I follow a few people around anything to do with API testing. It's so those they are like Buzz. Like, I can't take his surname. I can post it later on. He's the one. He's my go-to person when I have any questions or I want to understand. I think his posts are very informative, very valuable, and his blog post as well. And he has a lot of his work open sourced as part of his workshops. And Priscilla and Julia Pottinger. So I follow these people's posts and resources because they talk a lot about API, and Test Automation University, I think they have a lot of courses around API. So I think these are my go-to people when I look for asking for any questions or looking for, like, as a mentor, I would say.
Fantastic. Good. So we're almost on time, and what I'll do now is I'll stop the recording. Thank you so much, Parveen, and thank you everyone for joining. And we'll end it with a group photograph. I'll remove the pins on both of us, and maybe we'll take one last question. Says how to test for nested JSON response. Right? How do we test for nested JSON response? And after that, please do get ready, folks. We'll be on video and we'll take a photo. Yeah, Parveen, last question. How do we test for nested JSON response?
Yeah, I think I don't have I think it won't be a very great answer, but what I have done is the best way to approach that was like to do more when I see this complex payload for any endpoint that he has, like, I see that as a more exploratory kind of a candidate for me because that's how because it's so complex that I would only use that, or like automate only the happy path, like not like the most happy path journey, not journey, but the happy path test scenarios, but keep the rest for mostly exploring. Like, I think I know we call this as a manual, but I think that's the best way I can explore and find out what breaks it and what is it doing the expected behavior or not. So I think I won't go, like, I won't be able to give you any approach, but that's my go-to approach for when I see this nested or any kind of complex endpoint that I come across.
See, anything that's complex has simplicity within it as well. So break it down. Don't go trying to attack multiple factors at a time. Take one factor at a time. See the different parts, and then if there is nesting, like maybe 3 levels of nesting, check out, okay, what is that path that takes you till the last third level of nesting? Then what is it that takes you to the second level, then the first level, and then are there different ways to get there. Do you really need that nesting, or is there a way to directly hit that, right? And then the combo of the mandatory optional fields, and then the variations with the payload having everything, and then the payload having just the required stuff, and then coming up with data variations. You can try all of that. Yeah, so thank you all for the questions. Thank you for staying back, and thank you so much, Parveen, for being present here and sharing your expertise, your answers, and your knowledge. So thank you, everyone.